My whole life has been a lie.
The day I discovered my son wasn't mine began like any other Tuesday. I woke up with the same dull ache in my lower back that had been my constant companion for months now. The Georgia morning sunlight filtered through my bedroom curtains, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor of the home I'd lived in for nearly 40 years. I could hear Archer downstairs, slamming cabinet doors in the kitchen. He was angry about something. He always was. At 68, I'd grown accustomed to navigating my son's volatile moods. It had been just the two of us since Knox died in that terrible accident on Interstate 16 when Archer was only 4. 4 decades of walking on eggshells, of making excuses for his behavior to neighbors and the few friends I had left, of enduring his cutting remarks and cold silences. "Mom, where's the coffee?" His voice carried up the stairs, sharp and accusatory, as if I'd deliberately hidden it from him. I sighed, pushing myself up from the bed, wincing as another wave of pain radiated from my back. The doctor's appointment was at 10. I'd been putting it off for weeks, but Bertie had finally worn me down. She was the only one from the library who still checked on me years after my retirement. The others had gradually stopped calling after one too many canceled lunch dates or uncomfortable encounters with Archer. "Coming, honey," I called down, my voice carrying the forced cheerfulness I'd perfected over the years. The kitchen was a mess when I arrived downstairs. Archer stood in the middle of it, a scowl on his face that had long ago replaced the sweet smile of the little boy I remembered. At 42, my son was still handsome, with Knox's strong jaw and my auburn hair, though his was now streaked with gray at the temples. The physical resemblance to his father had been both a comfort and a torment over the years. "I've been calling you for 10 minutes, he said, though it had been less than 1. "I'm late for work." He worked as a real estate agent, though worked was perhaps too generous a term. His career consisted mostly of failed deals and squandered opportunities. Still, it gave him enough money to maintain appearances and supplement what he regularly withdrew from my accounts. The house was in my name, but that was about all I controlled anymore. "The coffee's in the same place it's always been, Archer." I moved past him to the pantry, retrieving the canister that sat exactly where it had for years. I didn't mention that he'd looked right at it and ignored it, just as I didn't mention the empty liquor bottle in the trash can. Some battles weren't worth fighting. "I have a doctor's appointment today," I said casually as I measured coffee grounds. "For my back. Bertie's picking me up around 9:30. His expression darkened. "That old busybody? Why can't you just take a cab, or reschedule when I can take you?" We both knew he would never take me. The last 3 appointments I'd scheduled around his availability had been canceled when he suddenly had important showings that couldn't wait. "It's just easier this way," I said, keeping my voice light. "She's heading that direction anyway." Archer slammed his mug on the counter hard enough that I jumped. Coffee sloshed over the sides, adding to the mess I would clean up after he left. "Fine, but don't let her fill your head with nonsense about senior living communities again. This is your home, and you're staying here where I can keep an eye on you." What he meant was that I was staying where he could keep his hands on my pension and the modest life insurance policy Knox had left. I nodded anyway, the path of least resistance worn smooth by years of use. After Archer left, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the photographs on the wall, I slowly cleaned the kitchen. My hands trembled slightly as I wiped down the counters. The pain in my back had spread to my side, a constant throbbing pressure that made it difficult to stand upright. I'd been ignoring it for too long, drinking herbal teas and taking over-the-counter pain medications that barely took the edge off. It was only when I noticed the strange color of my urine last week that real fear had finally pushed through my well-practiced denial. Bertie arrived exactly when she said she would, her ancient Volvo pulling into my driveway at 9:28. She'd been my colleague at the Savannah Public Library for over 20 years, and retirement hadn't dimmed her punctuality or her fierce loyalty. Her gray hair was cut in a stylish bob that suited her angular face, and she wore bright colors that had always seemed at odds with the hushed atmosphere of the library where we'd spent our careers. "You look like hell, Zelda," she said by way of greeting, giving me a quick hug as I slid into the passenger seat. Bertie had never been one to soften her words. "Always the charmer," I replied, but there was no heat in it. She was right, and we both knew it. Has Archer been helping you at all? You're obviously in pain. I looked out the window as we backed out of the driveway, watching my house, my prison, recede from view. He's busy with work, I said automatically. The same excuse I'd been making for him since he was a teenager. It's fine, I'm managing. Bertie snorted but didn't press. That was the unspoken agreement between us. She could express her disapproval of my son, but only to a point. Push too hard, and I would retreat, just as I had with everyone else who had tried to make me see what Archer was doing to me. Isolation was Archer's most effective tool, and over the years, he had wielded it masterfully. Dr. Juniper Quill was younger than I expected, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that I appreciated. She listened carefully as I described my symptoms, asking pointed questions about how long I'd been experiencing pain, the color of my urine, and whether there was a history of kidney disease in my family. I'd like to run some tests, she said after examining me. Your symptoms are consistent with kidney disease, possibly quite advanced. Why did you wait so long to come in, Mrs. Rowntree? I had no good answer for her. How could I explain that seeking medical care meant asking for permission in my own home? That the last time I'd mentioned feeling unwell, Archer had accused me of seeking attention and had hidden my car keys for a week. I thought it would get better on its own, I said finally. It was the coward's answer, but it was all I had. Dr. Quill's expression told me she didn't believe me, but she didn't challenge the lie. Instead, she ordered blood tests, urinalysis, and an ultrasound, all to be done immediately. The efficiency of the medical system when it sensed a serious problem was both reassuring and terrifying. It was nearly 3 o'clock when Dr. Quill called me back into her office. Bertie had insisted on waiting, settling herself in the waiting room with a thick historical novel and a thermos of tea. The doctor's expression was grave as I sat down across from her desk. Mrs. Rowntree, I'm afraid the news isn't good. Your kidneys are failing. The ultrasound shows significant damage to both kidneys, and your blood work confirms advanced kidney disease. Your creatinine levels are extremely elevated, indicating that your kidneys are functioning at less than 20% of normal capacity. The words washed over me like cold water. I had expected bad news, but not this. Not the gentle but firm way the doctor explained that I needed dialysis immediately, that my name would be added to the transplant list, but that at my age, with my blood type, the wait could be years. Is there any alternative to dialysis? I asked, thinking of the 3 times weekly appointments, the cost, the need to explain to Archer why his access to my bank accounts might be restricted by medical bills. A living donor is always the best option for a kidney transplant, Dr. Quill said. The success rates are higher, and we could potentially avoid dialysis altogether if we move quickly. Do you have any family members who might be willing to be tested for compatibility? My first thought was that Archer would never donate a kidney to me, even if he was a match. My second thought was that I would never ask him to, knowing that he would use my request as another way to control me, another debt I could never repay. Just my son, I said quietly. Dr. Quill nodded. Let's start the process of testing him then. Even if he's not a suitable donor, it's important that we explore all options. I left the office with a stack of pamphlets about kidney disease, dialysis, and transplantation, along with prescriptions for medications to help manage my symptoms and slow the progression of the disease. Bertie took one look at my face as I emerged into the waiting room and set her book aside. That bad? She asked. I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. She helped me to the car, and as we drove back toward my house, I finally found the words to tell her what the doctor had said. Bertie listened without interrupting, her hands tight on the steering wheel. Archer needs to be tested, she said when I finished. Immediately. He won't do it, I said, the certainty of 40 years of disappointment behind my words. Then we'll make him, Bertie replied, with a fierceness that reminded me of why I had always admired her, even when her straightforward nature made me uncomfortable. This is your life we're talking about, Zelda. The confrontation with Archer went exactly as I had expected. He arrived home late, smelling of alcohol and expensive cologne that wasn't his. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the pamphlets spread out before me. I had prepared his favorite meal, pot roast with roasted potatoes, hoping that it might soften the blow, might make him more receptive to what I needed to ask him. He barely glanced at the food, his eyes immediately going to the medical literature on the table. "What's all this?" he demanded, dropping his keys on the counter with a clatter. I explained as calmly as I could, walking the fine line between expressing the seriousness of my condition and not appearing to ask too much of him. With each word, I watched his expression shift from annoyance to something darker. "So, you need a kidney," he said when I finished, "and you want mine." "The doctor just wants to test if you're compatible," I said quickly. "That's all. Just a blood test." Archer laughed, a harsh sound that contained no humor. "And if I am compatible? Then what? They cut me open, take out a perfectly good kidney, and give it to you? Do you know what the recovery time is for that kind of surgery? What it would do to my career?" His career. The sporadic open houses and the occasional sale that barely covered his bar tabs and whatever he spent on the women whose perfume sometimes lingered on his clothes. The career that was more fiction than fact, just like the considerate son he pretended to be whenever anyone was watching. "They mentioned dialysis as another option," I said, already retreating. 3 times a week. I could take a cab." 3 times a week?" he interrupted. "Who's going to pay for that? And who's going to take care of the house while you're hooked up to some machine? Have you thought about any of this? Or did you just let that doctor talk you into expensive treatments you don't need?" I felt something crack inside me, a small fissure in the wall I'd built around my heart to protect myself from the reality of who my son had become. "I'm dying, Archer. My kidneys are failing. Without dialysis or a transplant, I will die. Soon." He stared at me for a long moment, and I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Concern, fear, even love. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll get tested. But don't get your hopes up. And we need to talk to the insurance company. I'm not going broke because you ignored your health until it was a crisis." He didn't touch the dinner I had prepared, instead grabbing his keys and leaving again, the door slamming behind him with finality. I sat alone at the table, the food growing cold, and allowed myself to cry for the first time since leaving the doctor's office. The testing process moved surprisingly quickly after that. Archer kept his word and went for the initial blood work, though he complained bitterly about having to take time off work. Dr. Quill called me herself 3 days later, asking if I could come into the office to discuss the results. There was something in her voice that made me insist on bringing Bertie with me rather than asking Archer to accompany me. "The initial compatibility tests show that Archer is not a suitable donor for you," Dr. Quill said once we were seated in her office. "In fact, the tests revealed something unexpected. Mrs. Roundtree, Archer is not biologically related to you." The room seemed to tilt around me. "That's not possible," I said automatically. "I gave birth to him at Memorial Health. April 12th, 1983. Dr. Quill's expression was gentle but firm. "The genetic markers don't lie, Mrs. Roundtree. There is no biological relationship between you and Archer. None at all." Bertie's hand found mine, squeezing tight as the doctor continued to explain about genetic markers and blood types, about how there was no possibility of error. The words washed over me, meaningless in the face of the impossible truth she was presenting. "There must have been a mix-up at the hospital, Doctor," Quill said finally. "It's rare, but it has happened. Babies switched at birth. Switched at birth." The phrase echoed in my mind, conjuring images from soap operas and sensational tabloid headlines. Not real life, not my life. But even as I tried to reject the idea, memories began to surface. The nurse who had seemed confused when she brought Archer to me after his first bath. The comment from Knox's mother, now long dead, about how the baby didn't look like either of us. My own private thoughts, quickly suppressed, about the stranger who sometimes looked back at me from my son's eyes. "If Archer isn't my biological son," I said slowly, "then where is my real child? And who are Archer's biological parents?" Dr. Quill leaned forward, her eyes compassionate. "That's something we might be able to help you find out if you want to know. There are genetic testing services, and the hospital would have records. But first, Mrs. Roundtree, we need to focus on your health. We'll need to start dialysis while we look for another donor option or wait for a deceased donor kidney." As we left the office, Bertie kept her arm around my shoulders, steadying me as my world continued to shift beneath my feet. 40 years of enduring Archer's cruelty, of making excuses for his behavior, of blaming myself for failing as a mother. 40 years of trying to find glimpses of Knox or myself in a man who had neither my blood nor my heart. "What are you going to do?" Bertie asked as we sat in her car in the hospital parking lot. "Are you going to tell him?" I looked out at the autumn afternoon, at the oak trees lining the streets of Savannah, their leaves just beginning to turn golden. Somewhere in this world, I had a son I had never known, a child of my body who had been raised by strangers, and in my home waited a man who had taken that child's place, who had spent a lifetime punishing me for a crime I hadn't committed. "Yes," I said, a strange calm settling over me. "I'm going to tell him, and then I'm going to find my real son." For the first time in 40 years, I felt the weight of responsibility for Archer lifting from my shoulders. He wasn't my son. The revelation wasn't just a medical fact. It was freedom. Freedom from the guilt and shame that had bound me to him, that had allowed him to control and manipulate me for decades. As Bertie started the car, I felt something else, something I hadn't expected. Hope. Hope that somewhere out there was a piece of myself I'd never known. Hope that it wasn't too late to find him. I didn't tell Archer that night, or the next. The words sat heavy on my tongue each time he entered the room, but something held me back. It wasn't fear, though there was plenty of that. It was the sudden realization that this knowledge gave me power I'd never possessed in our relationship. For the first time in 4 decades, I held a truth that would shatter his world as completely as it had shattered mine. I needed time to decide how to use it. Meanwhile, my body was failing me faster than expected. The medications Dr. Quill prescribed helped with the pain, but did little to slow the progression of my kidney disease. Within a week of the diagnosis, I found myself at Memorial Health 3 mornings a week, watching my blood flow through tubes into a dialysis machine that did the work my kidneys no longer could. The nurses were kind, especially a young woman named Tessa, who always made sure I had warm blankets and something to read during the 4-hour sessions. Archer drove me to the first appointment, complained about the wait, and never offered again. After that, Bertie rearranged her schedule to take me, or I called a cab when she couldn't. It was expensive, but I had started quietly moving small amounts of money from my joint account with Archer into a new account only I could access. Another small rebellion that gave me more satisfaction than it should have. "Have you thought more about looking for your biological son?" Bertie asked me during our drive home after my 4th dialysis session. The autumn sunlight filtered through the oak trees lining the street, casting dappled shadows across the dashboard of her Volvo. "I've been thinking about almost nothing else," I admitted. In the quiet hours connected to the dialysis machine, my mind had traveled back again and again to April of 1983, to the maternity ward where I had given birth after 20 hours of labor, to the baby boy they had placed in my arms, his face red and wrinkled, his eyes tightly shut. Had I held my true son even for those first moments? Or had the switch happened immediately, before I'd even seen him? "Dr. Quill gave me the contact information for a genetic counselor at the hospital," I continued. "Someone who helps with these cases. Apparently it happens more often than people think." Bertie snorted. "Babies being switched at birth? Sounds like something from one of those paperback novels we used to keep behind the circulation desk." I managed a small smile at the memory. The romance section, as we'd politely called it, had been populated with dog-eared paperbacks featuring impossibly handsome men and improbable plot twists. Life, I was learning, could be just as improbable. "The hospital still has records from that time," I said. "And there's genetic testing that might help identify him. It's worth trying, don't you think?" The question wasn't really for Bertie. It was for myself. Was it worth upending what remained of my life to search for a son I'd never known? A man who was now 42 years old, with a life and family of his own? What right did I have to disrupt that life with my sudden appearance? But the other questions were even more insistent. What if he needed to know his medical history? What if he had children, my grandchildren, who should know about potential genetic conditions? And the most selfish question of all, what if he was the kind of son I had always wanted Archer to be? "I think you need to do this," Bertie said firmly, answering the question I had asked and all the ones I hadn't. "For yourself, and for him, and maybe even for Archer, though God knows he doesn't deserve your consideration." We pulled up in front of my house, and I saw with relief that Archer's car wasn't in the driveway. These moments of solitude in my own home had become precious to me. Time when I could think without monitoring my expressions, when I could exist without bracing for the next cutting remark or subtle threat. "I'll call the genetic counselor tomorrow," I promised Bertie as she helped me to the door. The dialysis left me exhausted, my body heavy and uncooperative. "And I'll tell Archer. Soon." "Good," she said, giving my hand a squeeze before she left. "You don't have to carry this alone, Zelda." But I had been carrying things alone for most of my adult life. After Knox died, leaving me with a 4-year-old and a grief so vast I thought it would consume me, I had learned to shoulder burdens by myself. As Archer grew from a difficult child into a manipulative teenager and finally into the cruel man he was today, I had carried that too. The weight of my own failure as a mother, my inability to shape him into someone kind and good. Now I wondered how much of it had been nature rather than nurture, how much had been written in his genes rather than taught by my example. It was a question without an answer, but it haunted me nonetheless. The genetic counselor's name was Linnea Moss, and her office at Memorial Health was bright with potted plants and children's artwork. She was younger than me, but older than Dr. Quill, with silver-streaked dark hair and the calm, measured manner of someone accustomed to delivering life-altering news. "The first step is to confirm what the blood tests have already indicated," she explained, after I had shared my story. "We'll do a more comprehensive genetic test for you, and if possible for Archer as well. That will give us definitive proof that there's no biological relationship." "He won't agree to more tests," I said, certainty born from decades of experience. "He barely agreed to the first one, and that was only because he thought it might get him out of donating a kidney." Linnea nodded, unsurprised. "We can proceed without him. The next step would be to access the hospital records from when you gave birth. We need to identify other babies born around the same time who might have been switched with your son." "How many would there have been?" I asked, trying to imagine the scope of the search. In April of 1983, Memorial Health was smaller than it is today. Based on the records I've been able to access so far, there were 14 baby boys born between April 11th and April 13th. She consulted a file on her desk. "Of those, we can immediately eliminate 5 who were born to mothers of different races, which leaves 9 possibilities. 9 baby boys, 9 families, 9 lives that might have been intertwined with mine through a single moment of carelessness 4 decades ago. What happens when you identify them?" My voice sounded distant to my own ears, as if I were speaking from the bottom of a well. "We approach them carefully," Linnea said. "These situations require sensitivity. Some people may not want to know the truth. Others may already suspect something. We provide counseling and support throughout the process." I thought of Archer again, of how he would react to the news that he wasn't biologically mine. Would it matter to him? Would it change anything between us? Or would it just give him another weapon to use against me? "How long will this take?" I asked. Time had suddenly become precious to me in a way it never had been before. Dr. Quill had been carefully vague about my prognosis, but the look in her eyes when she reviewed my latest test results told me what she wouldn't say aloud. Without a transplant, my time was limited. "It depends," Linnea said honestly. "Finding the records might take a few weeks. Contacting the families and arranging for genetic testing will take more time. If everyone is cooperative, we might have answers within a month or 2. If not," she spread her hands in a gesture of uncertainty. A month or 2. It seemed both impossibly long and terrifyingly short. "I want to proceed," I said, my decision made. "Whatever it takes." Linnea smiled, the first real warmth I'd seen from her. "I'll start the process today." And Mrs. Rowntree? It's never too late to find the truth. I wondered if she was right about that. Archer was home when I returned, an unusual occurrence in the middle of a weekday. His car was in the driveway, and I could hear music playing from inside the house. Old jazz standards that Knox had loved and that Archer sometimes played when he was in one of his nostalgic moods. Those moods were dangerous. They made me lower my guard, made me see glimpses of the sweet boy he might have been, the man he could have become. He was in the living room, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand despite the early hour. The room smelled of alcohol and the same expensive cologne I'd noticed before, and there was a tension in his posture that put me instantly on alert. "Where have you been?" he asked without looking at me. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the edge beneath the calm. I had an appointment at the hospital, I said, which was true enough. Another one? Seems like you're there more than you're home these days. He took a sip of his whiskey, still not meeting my eyes. I called to check on you. They said you weren't scheduled for dialysis today. The fact that he had checked sent a chill through me. Archer rarely showed any interest in my medical care except to complain about the cost or inconvenience. It was with a specialist, I said, choosing my words carefully. For my condition. A specialist, he repeated. And does this specialist have a name? I hesitated, weighing my options. The truth was still a card I wasn't ready to play. Dr. Moss, I said finally. She's consulting on my case. Archer finally turned to look at me, his eyes narrowed. You're lying to me, Mom. You've been acting strange ever since that first appointment with Dr. Quill. What aren't you telling me? For a moment, I considered saying it. The words were right there. You're not my son. But the expression on his face, a volatile mix of suspicion and anger, stopped me. This wasn't the right moment. Not when he'd been drinking. Not when he was already on edge. I'm dying, Archer, I said instead. Another truth that I rarely spoke aloud. My kidneys are failing, and without a transplant, the dialysis can only help for so long. That's what they're not telling me, but I know it's true. I'm trying to get my affairs in order. Something flickered in his eyes. Concern? Fear? I couldn't tell. But the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. You're not dying, he said, turning away again. You're too stubborn to die. It was the closest thing to affection he had expressed in months. I'm still seeing about getting on the transplant list, I continued, moving carefully into the room and taking a seat across from him. But at my age, with my blood type, the wait could be too long. So, what's the solution? He asked, his voice flat. You've obviously been thinking about this. I had been thinking about it, turning possibilities over and over in my mind during those long hours of dialysis. The truth was that without a living donor, my chances were slim. And the only living donor who might have been a match was not my son after all. There are other options for finding donors, I said carefully. Extended family members sometimes match, or even unrelated donors who volunteer. Archer snorted. Extended family? You don't have any. And who's going to volunteer to give up a kidney for an old woman they don't even know? The casual cruelty of his words shouldn't have hurt after all this time, but they did. Perhaps because now I knew he truly wasn't mine, the pain of his rejection was even sharper. You'd be surprised what people are willing to do for others, I said, thinking of Bertie who had rearranged her entire life to help me since my diagnosis. Not everyone sees kindness as weakness. He flinched as if I'd struck him, and I realized with surprise that my words had hit a nerve. For all his bravado, Archer knew what he was, knew how he treated me, and on some level, it bothered him. Not enough to change, but enough to make him defensive when confronted with it. Is that what you think of me? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. That I'm unkind? After everything I've done for you? I almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. What had he ever done for me except take my money, my freedom, my self-respect? But again, I held back the truth. I think you're my son, I said, the lie bitter on my tongue. And that's all that matters to me. He studied me for a long moment, his eyes so like Knox's that it hurt to look at him. Had that been what blinded me all these years? The physical resemblance to my dead husband that had made me overlook all the ways Archer was nothing like him? You're hiding something from me, he said finally. I don't know what it is, but I'll find out. I always do. It was a threat, plain and simple. And he was right. He had always been skilled at uncovering my small secrets, my hidden rebellions. But this was different. This secret had the power to destroy the hold he had over me, and we both knew it, even if he didn't yet know what it was. I'm not hiding anything, I lied, standing up with an effort that wasn't entirely feigned. The dialysis really did leave me exhausted. I'm going to lie down for a while. He didn't try to stop me as I made my way upstairs to my bedroom, but I could feel his eyes on my back, suspicious and calculating. The confrontation had been delayed, not avoided, and next time, I might not be so lucky. The search for my biological son progressed with agonizing slowness. Linnea called weekly with updates that were rarely encouraging. Hospital records from 40 years ago had been partially digitized, but were incomplete. Some of the families she identified had moved away from Savannah, making them difficult to trace. Others were reluctant to engage when contacted, suspicious of what they saw as an intrusion into their private lives. Meanwhile, my health continued to deteriorate. The dialysis kept me alive, but couldn't halt the progression of my disease. I grew weaker, more tired. Simple tasks like climbing the stairs or cooking a meal became monumental challenges. Bertie visited more often, bringing groceries and helping with household chores that I could no longer manage. Archer noticed these changes but said nothing, watching me with an expression I couldn't interpret. It was almost 2 months after my initial meeting with Linnea when she called with news. "We've found a potential match," she said, her voice vibrating with cautious excitement. "A baby boy born on April 12, 1983, at Memorial Health, just hours after your delivery. The timing and circumstances make him our strongest candidate." My heart seemed to stutter in my chest. "Who is he? Where is he now?" "His name is Pike Landry," Linnea said. "He still lives in Savannah, not far from Memorial Health, actually. He's a construction project manager, married with 2 children. And Mrs. Roundtree, he's agreed to meet with us." Pike Landry. The name echoed in my mind, foreign yet intimately connected to me. My son. My actual biological son, who had been raised by strangers while I raised a stranger's son. "When?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow afternoon, if you're able." He was quite eager when I explained the situation. Eager. The word sent a flood of emotions through me: hope, fear, anticipation. Had he always wondered about his origins? Had he felt the same sense of disconnection from his family that Archer seemed to feel from me? "I'll be there," I promised. I hung up the phone and sat in the stillness of my kitchen, watching the late autumn sunlight slant through the windows. Tomorrow, I would meet the son I had given birth to, but never known. The son who might have been raised in this house, who might have sat at this very table eating meals I prepared, who might have grown into a man who treated me with kindness rather than contempt. And somewhere out there was a woman who had raised Archer, who had shaped him into the man he was today. Was she still alive? Did she wonder about the baby she had given birth to? Did she ever look at Archer and feel the same disconnect I had sometimes felt? A nagging sense that something wasn't quite right? I was lost in these thoughts when I heard the front door open and close. Archer's footsteps in the hallway, his keys landing on the side table with a clatter. I hadn't expected him home so early, hadn't planned what I would say to him. "Mom?" he called, his voice holding that false cheerfulness he sometimes adopted when he wanted something from me. "You home?" "In the kitchen," I replied automatically, trying to compose my features into something neutral, to hide the turmoil inside me. He appeared in the doorway, looking more put together than he had in weeks. His hair was freshly cut, his clothes pressed. He was carrying a paper bag from the pharmacy where I filled my prescriptions. "I picked up your medications," he said, setting the bag on the table in front of me. "The pharmacist said you were due for a refill but hadn't called it in yet." The unexpected thoughtfulness took me aback. "Thank you," I said, genuinely surprised. "That was kind of you." He shrugged, looking almost embarrassed by the acknowledgement. "Well, you've been forgetful lately. Can't have you missing doses." It was concern wrapped in criticism, the Archer special. But still, it was more consideration than he'd shown in months. "I saw Dr. Quill yesterday," he continued, opening the refrigerator and peering inside as if looking for something. "After work." I froze. "You did? Why?" He closed the refrigerator and turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to ask her about your prognosis, about how much time you have left without a transplant." The bluntness of the question shouldn't have shocked me, but it did. Archer had never been one to speak directly about my illness, preferring vague references and implied criticism. "What did she tell you?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. "Nothing useful," he said with a flash of the old bitterness. "Doctor-patient confidentiality. But she did say something interesting about the blood tests they ran, about why I wasn't a match for donation." My heart seemed to stop. This was it then, the moment I had been simultaneously dreading and longing for. "She said," Archer continued, his eyes fixed on my face, that according to the genetic markers, we're not related, that it's biologically impossible for me to be your son. He paused, watching me with an intensity that made me shrink back in my chair. Is that true? There was no point in lying anymore. The truth had found its way into the open, as truth so often does. Yes, I said simply. It's true. The word hung between us, heavy with 4 decades of history suddenly cast in a new light. How long have you known? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Since the first blood test, I admitted. About 2 months now. 2 months. He repeated the words slowly, as if testing their weight. You've known for 2 months that I'm not your son, and you didn't tell me. I could hear the anger building in his voice, see it in the tightening of his jaw and the flush spreading up his neck. I needed time to understand what it meant, I said, knowing even as I spoke that my explanation would mean nothing to him. To figure out what happened. What happened? He echoed, his voice rising. What happened is that my entire life has been a lie. Every time you called me your son, every time you claimed to love me, it was all a lie. No, I said, finding strength I didn't know I had. That wasn't a lie. I raised you. I loved you as my son. The lie was believing that love would be enough to overcome whatever darkness was inside you. The words were cruel, perhaps, but they were true. And after 40 years of swallowing truths to spare his feelings, to avoid his anger, I couldn't hold this one back. Archer stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen. I heard him go upstairs, heard drawers opening and closing, closet doors slamming. When he came back down 15 minutes later, he was carrying a suitcase. Where are you going? I asked, following him to the door. Away from here, he said without looking at me. Away from you and your lies. Archer, please, I said, reaching for him. We need to talk about this. There's more you need to know. He jerked away from my touch, his face twisted with an emotion I couldn't name. I don't need to know anything from you. Not ever again. The door slammed behind him, hard enough to rattle the windows. I stood in the sudden silence, listening to his car start, the tires squealing as he backed out of the driveway too fast. He was gone. After 40 years of emotional hostage-taking, of subtle and not-so-subtle abuse, of draining me financially and emotionally, Archer was gone. I should have felt relief, liberation. Instead, I felt a complicated grief for the son he had never been, for the mother I had tried so hard to be. But beneath the grief was something else, something growing stronger with each breath I took in the suddenly peaceful house. Hope. Tomorrow I would meet Pike Landry, the son I had never known, the son who might have been mine all along if fate or carelessness hadn't intervened. It wasn't too late. Not yet. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, images flashed through my mind. Archer as a toddler, his small hand in mine. Knox holding him on his shoulders at a 4th of July parade. The sullen teenager who retreated further from me with each passing year. The angry man who had walked out of my house, perhaps for the last time. And interspersed with these memories were imaginings of a boy I had never known. A child with my eyes or Knox's smile. Growing up in another home, with another mother. Morning came with a pale November sun that did little to warm the chill in the air. I dressed with unusual care, choosing a blue sweater that Bertie always said brought out the color in my eyes, and the pearl earrings Knox had given me on our 10th anniversary. My hands trembled as I fastened them, partly from the weakness that had become my constant companion, partly from the enormity of what lay ahead. Bertie arrived precisely at 9, as reliable as ever. She took one look at my face and knew. Archer knows, she said, not a question, but a statement. I nodded, gesturing for her to come in from the cold. He found out from Dr. Quill yesterday. He's gone, packed a bag and left. She didn't ask where he had gone or whether he would be back. Those questions seemed insignificant in the face of what was to come. Are you ready for this? She asked instead, following me into the kitchen where I had made tea neither of us would drink. No, I admitted, my voice steadier than I expected. But I'm going anyway. The drive to Memorial Health felt interminable. The familiar streets of Savannah passed by in a blur as my thoughts raced ahead to the meeting that awaited me. What would he look like, this son of mine? Would I see Knox in him? Or myself? Would there be an immediate connection, some primal recognition between mother and child? Or would we be strangers to each other, linked only by genetics and the bizarre twist of fate that had separated us for 42 years? Linnea was waiting for us in the hospital lobby, her professional demeanor softened by what looked like genuine excitement. "Mrs. Rowntree," she greeted me, taking my cold hands in her warm ones. "He's here, in my office. Are you ready to meet him?" Ready or not, the moment had arrived. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The walk to Linnea's office seemed both endless and too short. With each step, I rehearsed what I might say to this stranger who was my flesh and blood. How do you condense a lifetime into a few sentences? How do you explain your absence from someone's entire existence? And then suddenly we were there, Linnea's hand on the doorknob, turning it with a click that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet corridor. "Mrs. Rowntree is here," she announced as she opened the door. The man who rose to his feet as we entered was tall, taller than Archer, taller than Knox had been. His hair was the same auburn shade as mine had been before it turned silver, and his eyes, oh, his eyes were Knox's exactly, the same warm brown that had always reminded me of autumn leaves. He was dressed simply in jeans and a button-down shirt, and there was a wedding ring on his left hand. "Mrs. Rowntree," he said, his voice deep and slightly rough, as if he were fighting emotion. "I'm Pike Landry." We stood there for a long moment, taking each other in. I searched his face for traces of myself, of Knox, of the baby I had held so briefly all those years ago, and I found them. The shape of his jaw, the slight cleft in his chin that Knox had, the way he stood with his weight shifted slightly to one side, just as I did. "You have my hair," I said finally, the words escaping before I could consider them. "And your father's eyes." Something in his expression shifted, softened. "I always wondered where these came from," he said, touching his hair self-consciously. "No one else in the Landry family has this color." The stumble over how to refer to the family who raised him broke my heart a little. This was as strange and disorienting for him as it was for me. "Please, sit down," Linnea urged both of us, gesturing to the comfortable chairs arranged in a small circle in her office. "I know you both must have 1,000 questions." We sat, Pike and I across from each other, with Bertie beside me and Linnea between us, a buffer of sorts. For a moment, no one spoke. Where does one begin a conversation like this? "Ms. Moss has explained the situation to me," Pike said finally, breaking the silence. "About the blood tests and how they discovered the mix-up." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "But I'd like to hear it from you, if that's okay. When did you find out? What made you decide to look for me?" The direct questions were a relief. They gave me a place to start, a way into the impossible conversation we were having. I told him everything, from the first symptoms of my kidney disease to Dr. Quill's startling revelation to the search that had led us to him. I spoke of Archer, too, not the worst of it, but enough for Pike to understand that our relationship had been difficult, that my son had not been the person I had hoped he would become. Pike listened intently, his eyes never leaving my face. There was compassion there, and curiosity, and something else I couldn't quite name. A hunger, perhaps, for the truth about his origins that he had never known. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I had told him. Then he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I always knew I was different," he said, his voice low. "Not just the way I looked, but other things. I loved books, reading. Both my parents, the Landrys, they were good people, kind people, but neither of them were readers. My dad worked construction his whole life. My mom was a homemaker. They didn't understand why I'd rather be inside with a book than outside playing ball." A small, sad smile crossed his face. "They tried, though. They really did. Bought me books for Christmas and birthdays, even though they didn't really get why I wanted them. It was surreal to hear about his childhood, about the people who had raised my son, given him values and love and a sense of identity that had nothing to do with me. "Are they still alive?" I asked. "Your parents?" Pike nodded. "My dad passed about 5 years ago. Heart attack. But my mom is still around. Lives about 20 minutes from me. She helps with my kids a lot." His kids? My grandchildren? The thought nearly took my breath away. "You have children?" I asked, though Linnea had already told me this. His face softened, the way parents' faces do when they speak of their children. "2. Emma is 12 and Miles is 9. Good kids, smart." He hesitated, then reached for his wallet, extracting a photograph. "This is from last summer, family vacation to the Outer Banks." He handed me the photo, and my hands trembled as I took it. A smiling family looked back at me from a sunlit beach, Pike with his arm around a pretty, dark-haired woman, and 2 children in front of them. The girl had her mother's coloring, but something about the shape of her face, the set of her eyes, reminded me of my own mother. The boy was all Knox, from his tousled brown hair to the slight gap between his front teeth that had been so endearing in my husband. "They're beautiful," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "They look happy." "They are," Pike confirmed, taking the photo back and looking at it with obvious pride before returning it to his wallet. "I've been lucky that way. Good marriage, good kids. A job I enjoy." There was no resentment in his voice, no sense that he felt he had missed out on anything by being raised by the Landrys instead of by Knox and me. It was a relief, in a way, to know that the cosmic mistake that had deprived me of my biological child hadn't harmed him. "What about you?" he asked, turning the conversation back to me. "Ms. Moss explained about your kidney disease. How serious is it?" The directness of the question caught me off guard. Archer would never have asked so plainly, preferring to dance around difficult topics with innuendo and passive aggression. "It's advanced," I admitted. "The dialysis is helping, but my doctors have been clear that without a transplant, my prognosis isn't good." Pike nodded, absorbing this information with the same quiet intensity he had shown throughout our conversation. "And that's why you were testing Archer for compatibility, which led to the discovery that he wasn't your biological son." "Yes," I said, though I'm not sure he would have donated even if he had been a match. The words were out before I could stop them, a truth I had rarely acknowledged even to myself. Pike's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. A flash of something that might have been anger, quickly controlled. "Well," he said after a moment, "that brings me to something I wanted to discuss with you. I've already spoken with Ms. Moss about it, and with my wife, Marissa. I want to be tested to see if I'm a compatible donor for you." The offer, made so simply and directly, stunned me into silence. This man who had known of my existence for less than a week was offering me his kidney, offering to undergo major surgery and permanent alteration to his body for a woman who was, in every way that mattered, still a stranger to him. "Pike," I began, struggling to find words. "I can't ask that of you. We've only just met. You have a family, a life." "You didn't ask," he interrupted gently. "I'm offering, and yes, we've only just met, but—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The way I see it, we're connected, not just by blood, but by this strange circumstance that neither of us chose. I can't change the past 42 years, but I can do something about right now. If I can help, I want to." I looked at Birdie, seeking some grounding in the face of this unexpected turn. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and she nodded slightly, encouraging me to accept what was being offered. "The testing is just the first step," Linnea added, her professional tone softened by obvious emotion. "There would be extensive screening, psychological evaluation, more discussions. No decisions need to be made today." I turned back to Pike, this son I had just met, this man who was offering me a second chance at life as surely as he was offering me his kidney. "Thank you," I said simply. "I would be grateful if you would be tested." He smiled then, a smile that transformed his face and sent a jolt of recognition through me. Knox had smiled exactly like that. A full, genuine expression that lit up his entire face. "Good," he said. "We can start the process today, if that works for you." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of medical discussions and logistics. Linnea explained the testing process, the timeline, the various screenings that would need to be done. Pike asked thoughtful, practical questions that revealed he had already done research on kidney donation. Birdie took notes, knowing that my overwhelmed mind would retain little of the technical details. As the meeting wound down, an awkward moment arose. What came next? We had met, shared our stories, made medical plans. But what did this new relationship look like outside the structured environment of Linnea's office? Pike resolved the question with the same straightforward approach he had shown throughout our encounter. "Would you like to meet my family?" he asked, as we prepared to leave. "Not today. I know this has been overwhelming enough, but soon. My wife wants to meet you, and the kids? Well, they're curious about their new grandmother." Grandmother. The word sent a rush of emotion through me so intense I had to grip the arm of my chair to steady myself. "I would love that," I managed to say. "Whenever you think is appropriate." "How about Sunday?" he suggested. "We could do lunch at our place. Nothing fancy, just a chance to get to know each other better." Sunday, just 3 days away. It seemed both too soon and not soon enough. Sunday would be perfect, I said. We exchanged phone numbers and addresses, the mundane details of connecting our lives in a practical way. And then it was time to leave, to return to our separate existences with the knowledge that everything had changed. At the door to Linnea's office, Pike hesitated, then did something that surprised me. He hugged me, a brief, gentle embrace that communicated more than words could have. I found myself hugging him back, this tall stranger who was somehow also part of me. "I'll see you Sunday," he said as he pulled away. "Take care of yourself until then." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and then he was gone, striding down the corridor with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, in his place in the world. Bertie drove me home, respecting my need for silence as I processed the enormity of what had just occurred. It wasn't until we were pulling into my driveway that I realized Archer's car was parked in front of the house. He had returned. "Do you want me to come in with you?" Bertie asked, eyeing the car warily. Part of me did, but another part, a stronger part, knew this was a conversation I needed to have alone. "No," I said, "but thank you. For everything today." She squeezed my hand. "Call me if you need me, day or night." I found Archer in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and the morning's newspaper spread out before him, as if it were any ordinary day. He looked up when I entered, his expression unreadable. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone casual but with an undercurrent I knew too well. "At the hospital," I replied, deciding that honesty was the only path forward. "Meeting my biological son." Archer's hand tightened on his coffee cup, his knuckles white against the ceramic. "So you found him. That didn't take long." The accusation was clear in his voice, that I had been searching for my real son behind his back, eager to replace him with someone better. "The hospital had records," I said, keeping my voice neutral. It wasn't difficult once they knew what to look for. I moved to the refrigerator, more to give myself something to do than out of any real interest in its contents. I could feel Archer's eyes on me, calculating, assessing. "And what's he like, this long-lost son of yours?" he asked, the bitter edge in his voice now unmistakable. "Everything you always wanted me to be, I'm sure." I closed the refrigerator door and turned to face him. "He's a stranger to me, Archer. A man I just met today. I don't know what he's like, not really. But you're going to find out, aren't you?" He stood abruptly, pushing back from the table with enough force that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Going to play one big happy family and forget all about the 40 years you spent raising me." The accusation stung, not least because there was a kernel of truth in it. Hadn't I spent the drive to the hospital wondering what life might have been like if Pike had been the one raised in this house? Hadn't I seen his kindness, his straightforward decency, and wished that Archer had possessed those qualities? "I'm not trying to replace you, Archer," I said carefully. "Nothing can change the fact that I raised you, that you were my son in every way that matters for 4 decades. Were," he repeated, latching on to the past tense with the unerring instinct he had always had for my verbal missteps. "So that's it. I was your son, but now that you've found your real one, I'm not anymore." "That's not what I meant," I began, but he cut me off. "Save it," he said, his voice hard. "I know exactly what you meant. I've always known I was never good enough for you. Now I know why. You were always looking for someone else, someone who wasn't me." The unfairness of the accusation took my breath away. Had I not spent 40 years trying to love him despite his cruelty? Had I not made excuses for him, defended him, supported him financially and emotionally, long past the point when most parents would have given up? "That's not true," I said, finding a strength in my voice I hadn't known I possessed. I have loved you, Archer. I have tried to be the mother you needed. If I failed, it wasn't for lack of trying or lack of love. He laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. Love? Is that what you call it? Constantly criticizing me, never believing in me, always looking disappointed? Was that how he saw me? How he interpreted my attempts to guide him, to help him become a better man? The realization that we had been living in entirely different realities for 40 years was devastating. I'm sorry if that's how it felt to you, I said, meaning it despite everything. That was never my intention. Well, your intentions don't matter much now, do they? He said, moving toward the door. Now that you've got your real son. I'm sure he's perfect. I'm sure he'll give you exactly what you want. Pike has offered to be tested as a kidney donor, I said quietly. The words stopped Archer in his tracks. He turned slowly to face me, disbelief written across his features. He what? You've known him for what, a few hours? And he's offering you a kidney? He shook his head. No one is that selfless. What's he really after? Your money? This house? It was so typically Archer to assume the worst motives in others, to see every act of kindness as a transaction with hidden costs. And perhaps that was the fundamental difference between him and Pike. One saw the world as a zero-sum game where someone always lost, the other as a place where generosity was possible without expectation of return. Not everyone sees the world the way you do, Archer, I said, suddenly too tired to fight anymore. Sometimes people just want to help because they can. He stared at me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. For a second, I thought I saw genuine hurt there, a vulnerability that he usually kept carefully hidden. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar mask of contempt. Well, I hope you and your perfect new family are very happy together, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Don't worry about me. I'll be just fine. He stalked out of the kitchen and up the stairs. I heard him moving around in his old bedroom, the sound of drawers opening and closing, closet doors sliding. He was collecting more of his things, I realized, making his exit more permanent. I sank into a chair at the kitchen table, too exhausted to follow him, to try once more to explain what seemed inexplicable, that finding Pike didn't erase 40 years of being Archer's mother, that there was room in my heart for both of them, complicated as that might be. When he came back down 20 minutes later, he was carrying another suitcase and a box of what looked like old photographs and keepsakes. I'll be back for the rest of my stuff later, he said, not meeting my eyes. I'm staying with a friend for now, but I'll find my own place soon. I nodded, not asking who the friend was or where he would go. Those details seemed unimportant in the face of the larger rupture between us. You can take whatever you need, I said. This is still your home, Archer. That hasn't changed. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I thought he might say something more, might open a door to a different kind of conversation between us. But the moment passed, and he merely nodded before turning to leave. At the door, he paused, his back to me. I hope he's a match, he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. For the kidney. I hope it works out. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to mark the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. I sat in the silent kitchen for a long time after Archer left, thinking about the strange turns my life had taken. 2 months ago, I had been a woman dying of kidney disease, trapped in a toxic relationship with a son who seemed to despise me. Now I was still dying, still in need of a transplant, but everything else had changed. I had found my biological son, a man who seemed as kind as Archer was cruel, and Archer himself had walked out of my life, perhaps forever. The thought brought a complicated mix of grief and relief. Grief for the son I had raised, for the relationship we had never managed to build, for the love that had never been enough to bridge the chasm between us. Relief for the freedom his absence gave me, for the chance to breathe without constantly monitoring his moods, for the opportunity to build something new with Pike and his family without Archer's bitter presence casting a shadow over everything. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. Despite the exhaustion that weighed on me, despite the constant pain that was my companion now, I felt a flutter of anticipation at the thought of meeting Pike's wife and children, my daughter-in-law, my grandchildren. Family I never knew I had. I thought of Knox then, of how he would have reacted to all of this. He had been dead for nearly 4 decades, and yet I still found myself turning to his memory in moments of crisis or joy, seeking his wisdom, his steadfast presence. He would have been devastated to learn that the boy he had loved as his son was not his blood, but he would have embraced Pike without hesitation, would have delighted in his grandchildren, would have faced the whole impossible situation with the same quiet courage he had shown in every aspect of his life. "I wish you were here," I whispered to the empty room. "I wish you could see our son." There was no answer, of course, just the ticking of the old clock on the wall, marking the passage of time that had brought me to this strange crossroads in my life. Time that, with Pike's help, might be extended beyond what the doctors had initially predicted. Time to get to know my true son, to build a relationship with him and his family, to finally find the connection I had been seeking for 40 years. The kidney disease that had seemed like a death sentence had instead become the key to unlocking a truth that might have remained hidden forever. In seeking a physical salvation, I had found an emotional one as well. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I found myself looking forward to tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days that might come after that. Sunday arrived with uncharacteristically warm weather for November in Savannah. I stood in front of my closet, deliberating over what to wear to meet my grandchildren for the first time. I settled on a cornflower blue dress that had always been one of my favorites, though it hung looser on my frame now than it once had. The woman in the mirror looked tired, fragile, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope. Bertie insisted on driving me to Pike's house, fretting over my energy levels after dialysis the day before. As we turned onto his street in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Savannah, my heart raced with anticipation and nervousness. His home was a tidy 2-story with a wide front porch and children's bicycles leaning against the railings. It looked lived in, loved, exactly the kind of home I had always wanted to provide. Pike opened the door before we even reached the steps, his smile warm and welcoming. Behind him stood a petite woman with dark curly hair and a kind face, Marissa, his wife, and half hidden behind her, 2 children who watched me with undisguised curiosity. "Welcome," Pike said, coming down to help me up the stairs, his hand gentle but steady under my elbow. "We're so glad you could come." Lunch was a surreal experience, sitting at a table with these people who were both strangers and family, listening to 12-year-old Emma chatter about her soccer team, watching 9-year-old Miles demonstrate a magic trick he had been practicing. Marissa was warm but reserved, studying me with thoughtful eyes as Pike told stories about his construction projects, carefully building bridges between his world and mine. "Dad says you used to be a librarian," Emma said during a lull in the conversation. "Did you read all the books in the library?" The innocent question made me laugh, the sound surprising even to my own ears. When was the last time I had truly laughed? "Not quite all of them," I replied, "but I tried my best." "I love reading too," she said earnestly. "Dad says that must be where I get it from. From you. From you." The simple words held so much meaning, an acknowledgement of the genetic connection that tied us together despite the years apart. After lunch, while Marissa and the children cleared the table, waving away my offers of help with firm insistence that I was a guest, Pike and I moved to the porch where 2 rocking chairs stood side by side, overlooking a small but well-tended garden. "I've been officially approved as a donor," he said without preamble. "The final tests came back yesterday." "We're a match." The words hung in the air between us, their significance almost too profound to absorb. This man, my son who had been lost to me for 42 years, was offering me life. "Pike," I began, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. "I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head, his expression serious. "No thanks needed. You would have done the same for me." The certainty in his voice humbled me. He believed without question that I would have sacrificed for him, loved him unconditionally, all without knowing me, without the benefit of the years that might have proven such things. "The surgery is scheduled for next week," he continued. "Dr. Quill wants to move quickly, given your condition. Marissa will be with me, and Bertie has already volunteered to stay with you during your recovery." Everything was moving so fast, the medical realities cutting through the emotional complexities with swift efficiency. In just over a week, I would be receiving my son's kidney, a physical connection to replace all the years we had missed. "Have you heard from Archer?" Pike asked after a moment of silence, his voice carefully neutral. I shook my head. "Not since he came to collect more of his things. I'm not sure I ever will." The thought brought a now familiar mixture of sadness and relief. 40 years of emotional manipulation had left its mark, but the absence of constant tension in my home was like taking a full breath after years of only being able to manage shallow ones. "I'm sorry," Pike said simply. "That must be difficult, regardless of how he treated you." The compassion in his voice brought tears to my eyes. How strange that this man who had known me for less than 2 weeks understood what most people never had, that loving Archer had never been the problem. The problem had been that love alone wasn't enough to fix what was broken in him, in our relationship. "Yes," I agreed. "It is. But this," I gestured to encompass the house, the family inside it. Pike himself. "This is a gift I never expected, never could have imagined." The afternoon passed in a gentle haze of conversation and connection. Miles showed me his collection of rocks and minerals, explaining each specimen with scientific precision. Emma brought out photo albums and school projects, eager to fill in the blanks of a life I had missed. Marissa shared recipes and garden tips, her initial reserve gradually warming into something that felt like friendship, or the beginnings of it. As the day waned and it came time to leave, Pike walked me and Bertie to the car. The children had extracted a promise that I would return the following weekend, and Marissa had pressed a container of homemade cookies into my hands with firm instructions to keep up my strength for the surgery. At the car, Pike surprised me with a hug, less hesitant than the one we had shared in Linnea's office. "We'll get through this," he said quietly. "All of it. The surgery, the recovery, figuring out what kind of relationship we want to have. One day at a time. One day at a time." It was how I had survived 40 years with Archer, how I had coped with losing Knox so young, how I had faced my diagnosis. But for the first time, those words felt like a promise rather than a sentence, a path leading towards something rather than simply away from pain. Bertie was unusually quiet on the drive home, respecting my need to process the day. It wasn't until we were nearly back at my house that she spoke. "You know," she said, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, "I've known you for over 30 years, Zelda. This is the first time I've ever seen you look truly at peace." Peace? Was that what this feeling was? This strange lightness in my chest, despite the constant pain in my back, this sense that whatever happened next, whether the transplant was successful or not, whether Archer ever returned or remained estranged, I had found something I hadn't known I was missing. As we pulled into my driveway, I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked on the street in front of my house. A woman sat inside it, her hands gripping the steering wheel as if gathering courage. When she saw us arrive, she slowly got out of the car and waited on the sidewalk, uncertainty written in every line of her body. She was perhaps my age, with silver-streaked dark hair and features that struck me with immediate, visceral recognition. I had seen that face before, in Archer's high school graduation photo, in his angry scowl across the dinner table, in the mirror on days when stress had drawn my own features tight. "Mrs. Rowntree?" she called as I got out of Bertie's car. "I'm Fern Landry, Pike's mother, Archer's biological mother. I think we need to talk." Life has a way of coming full circle in the most unexpected ways. If you've been through something similar with family revelations, please share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences help others feel less alone. And if this story touched you, please hit that subscribe button to follow my journey. There's so much more to tell as this new chapter of my life unfolds.